Sarah Martinez wiped down the coffee counter for the 20th time that morning, her hands moving in practiced circles across the worn surface. The downtown coffee shop buzzed with its usual crowd of office workers, college students, and tourists, but today felt different. Today, she could feel the weight of their stares more than usual. At 28, Sarah had been working at Brew and Bean for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to San Diego after her military discharge. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her the flexibility she needed for her night classes at the community college. What her customers didn't know, what nobody in this coffee shop could possibly understand, was that the quiet woman behind the counter had once been Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, United States Navy, decorated for her service in intelligence operations that she could never discuss. The morning rush was in full swing when the group of young professionals walked in. Sarah recognized them immediately. They were regulars from the tech startup 3 blocks down. Usually, they were polite enough, ordering their complicated drinks with the casual entitlement of people who had never known real hardship. But, today, something was different about their energy. There was a meanness in their laughter, a sharpness in their voices that made Sarah's military-trained instincts prickle with awareness. "Oh look, it's our favorite coffee girl," announced Jessica, the apparent leader of the group. She was tall, blonde, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her designer handbag probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. "I'll take my usual, but this time try not to mess up the foam art. I know it's challenging for someone like you." Sarah kept her expression neutral, years of military discipline serving her well. "Of course. 1 large oat milk latte with an extra shot, coming right up." She turned to the espresso machine, her movements precise and efficient. Behind her, she could hear the group settling into their usual corner table, their voices carrying across the shop with deliberate volume. They wanted to be heard. They wanted an audience for whatever performance they were about to put on. "I honestly don't understand why they hire people like that," Jessica continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I mean, look at her. She's got to be pushing 30, and she's still making coffee. No education, no ambition, probably no skills beyond pushing buttons on a machine." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she continued working. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled, a familiar sound that usually brought her comfort. Today, it felt like white noise against the growing cruelty behind her. "Maybe she's just not smart enough for real work," chimed in Marcus, Jessica's boyfriend and business partner. He was the type of man who wore expensive sneakers with his suits and thought it made him relatable. "I read somewhere that some people just aren't built for success. They're happier in service positions." The other members of their group laughed, a sound that made other customers glance over with uncomfortable expressions. Sarah noticed an elderly man at the counter frowning at the group, and a young mother gathering her children closer to her table. The atmosphere in the shop was shifting, becoming tense and ugly. Sarah finished the latte, creating a perfect leaf pattern in the foam despite her rising anger. She'd learned to channel her emotions into precision during her military service, and that training served her now. She carried the drink to their table, setting it down with careful control. "Here you go. 1 oat milk latte with extra shot." Jessica examined the cup with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it in different directions as if she were inspecting a diamond for flaws. Not bad. Though I suppose even someone with limited capabilities can follow simple instructions when they try hard enough." Sarah started to turn away, but Jessica wasn't finished. "You know, Sarah, that is your name, right? I've always wondered what your story is. Did you just never apply yourself in school? Or maybe you're one of those people who peaked in high school and never figured out how to grow up?" The other customers were openly staring now. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others simply curious about the unfolding drama. She'd faced down armed insurgents in classified locations around the world, but somehow this public humiliation in a coffee shop felt like a different kind of battle entirely. "I'm just here to serve coffee," Sarah replied evenly. "Is there anything else you need?" "Oh, we're just trying to understand," Marcus jumped in, sensing his girlfriend's momentum. "I mean, no judgment, but don't you ever feel embarrassed? Working a teenager's job when you're old enough to have a real career?" My little sister is 16 and she's already planning for medical school. What happened to your plans? Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. These people had no idea what they were talking about, no understanding of the sacrifices she'd made or the reasons behind her choices. They saw a woman in a coffee shop uniform and assumed they understood her entire story. The assumptions, the casual cruelty, the complete lack of empathy, it all combined into something that made her want to scream. Instead, she smiled. It was the same smile she'd used when interrogating prisoners who thought they were smarter than she was. Everyone has their path. This happens to be mine right now. Right now, Jessica repeated mockingly. That's what unsuccessful people always say. Right now, as if something's going to magically change. Honey, if you haven't figured it out by 30, you probably never will. The group erupted in laughter again, and this time several other customers looked genuinely offended. An older gentleman at the counter cleared his throat loudly, and a woman near the window shook her head in disgust. But Jessica and her friends were too caught up in their performance to notice or care about the reaction they were generating. Sarah retreated behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she began cleaning the espresso machine. She'd been trained to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically even when emotions ran high. But this felt personal in a way that combat never had. In the military, she'd been fighting for something bigger than herself. Here, she was just trying to get through the day without losing her dignity. You know what I think? Jessica's voice carried across the shop like nails on a chalkboard. I think some people are just born to serve others. It's like a natural hierarchy. Some of us are meant to build companies and change the world, and others are meant to bring us coffee while we do it. Sarah gripped the counter, her knuckles white. She thought about the commendation in her apartment, locked away in a box she rarely opened. The letter from the Admiral, thanking her for her exceptional service in the face of extraordinary danger. The security clearance that still technically existed, though she'd never use it again. The friends she'd lost, the missions she couldn't talk about, the sacrifices that had brought her to this place. These people knew nothing about service. They knew nothing about sacrifice or duty or putting others before yourself. They lived in a bubble of privilege and assumption, never questioning whether their success came from their own merit or simply from being born into the right circumstances. I bet she doesn't even have a high school diploma, Marcus continued, emboldened by his audience. Probably dropped out to have kids or something. You can always tell the ones who made bad choices early and never recovered. Sarah's military training kicked in, the same mental discipline that had kept her alive in dangerous situations. She focused on her breathing, on the familiar routine of cleaning and organizing. She thought about her goals, finishing her degree, maybe starting her own business someday, building something meaningful with her life. These people's opinions didn't matter. Their cruelty said more about them than it did about her. But even as she tried to maintain her composure, she could feel something building inside her chest. It was frustration, yes, but also a deep sadness. Not for herself, but for a world where people could be so casually cruel to someone they didn't know. Where success was measured only in dollars and status, where service was seen as failure rather than honor. The morning customers began to thin out, but Jessica's group showed no signs of leaving. They'd found their entertainment for the day, and they seemed determined to milk it for all it was worth. Sarah watched them through the reflection in the coffee machine, noting how they fed off each other's energy, how the cruelty escalated with each exchange. She'd seen this behavior before, in different contexts. Bullies were the same everywhere, whether they wore expensive suits or military uniforms or street clothes. They picked their targets based on perceived weakness, and they rarely stopped until someone made them stop. Sarah just never expected to find herself on the receiving end of it in a coffee shop in America, the country she'd sworn to defend. The bell above the door chimed again, signaling another customer, but Sarah didn't look up immediately. She was focused on steaming milk for another order, trying to find peace in the familiar rhythm of her work. It wasn't until she heard the conversation at the corner table suddenly stop that she glanced toward the entrance. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jessica's mouth, which had been open mid-sentence, snapped shut. Marcus straightened in his chair like someone had pulled a string attached to his spine. The other members of their group looked like children caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Sarah followed their gaze to the door and felt her breath catch in her throat. Standing just inside the entrance was a man in his early 60s, tall and distinguished with silver hair and intense blue eyes. He wore a simple navy blazer and khakis, but everything about his bearing screamed military authority. She couldn't see his rank insignia from where she stood, but she didn't need to. Some things were unmistakable to someone with her background. The man's eyes swept the coffee shop with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading rooms and situations quickly. When his gaze landed on the corner table, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but Sarah caught it, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. He'd heard them. Of course he'd heard them. Jessica's group had made sure everyone in the shop could hear their performance. Sarah watched as the man approached the counter, his movement precise and purposeful. When he reached the register, he looked directly at her with an intensity that made her stand a little straighter despite herself. "Good morning," he said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without him having to raise it. "I'll take a black coffee, large." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself. Old habits died hard. As she poured his coffee, she could feel him studying her, though not in the invasive way that Jessica's group had. This felt different, like recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. When she handed him the cup, their eyes met again, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. He knew. Somehow, this stranger knew exactly what had been happening in his coffee shop. The distinguished man took his coffee and surveyed the shop once more, his gaze lingering on the corner table where Jessica's group sat in uncomfortable silence. Sarah watched as he chose a table directly across from them, positioning himself where he had a clear view of both their table and the counter where she worked. The atmosphere in the coffee shop had shifted dramatically. Other customers seemed to sense the change, their conversations dropping to whispers as they glanced between the corner table and the silver-haired stranger. Jessica fidgeted with her phone, no longer the confident tormentor she'd been moments before. Marcus stared into his coffee cup as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she found herself stealing glances at the mysterious customer. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place what it was. The way he held himself, the quiet confidence, the alert awareness of his surroundings, it all spoke of someone accustomed to command, someone who had spent years making decisions that mattered. Sarah called out Tom, the shop manager, emerging from the back office. "I need you to take inventory of the pastry case. We're running low on the blueberry muffins." As Sarah moved around the counter with her clipboard, she passed closer to the silver-haired man's table. Without looking up from his newspaper, he spoke quietly, his voice pitched just loud enough for her to hear. "Chin up, sailor. Some battles aren't worth fighting, but that doesn't mean you're not still a warrior." Sarah's pen froze over her clipboard. Sailor. He'd called her sailor. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the implications sank in. This man wasn't just military, he was Navy, and somehow he'd recognized something in her that marked her as former service. She managed to complete her count of the pastries, though she could barely focus on the numbers. When she returned to behind the counter, she found herself watching the stranger with new eyes. Who was he? How had he known? And, more importantly, what was he planning to do about what he'd witnessed? The answer came sooner than she expected. The man folded his newspaper with crisp precision and stood up, his movement drawing the attention of everyone in the shop. He walked directly to the corner table where Jessica's group sat, his approach unhurried but purposeful. When he reached their table, he simply stood there, saying nothing, his presence commanding their attention without him having to ask for it. "Excuse me," Jessica finally stammered, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. "Can we help you with something?" The man smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, the kind that made smart people nervous and stupid people stupid. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation earlier. You were discussing the young woman behind the counter." Marcus cleared his throat, trying to summon some of his earlier bravado. It was just casual conversation. Nothing personal. Nothing personal, the man repeated thoughtfully. Interesting perspective. When you judge someone's worth based on their job, question their intelligence, and mock their life choices in a public space, you consider that impersonal? The group exchanged nervous glances. Jessica attempted to regain control of the situation. Look, we don't know who you are, but this is really none of your business. It was just office talk. Office talk. The man's voice remained calm, conversational even, but something in his tone made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. I see. And what office would that be? We work at TechFlow Solutions, Marcus said, puffing out his chest slightly. It's a startup that's been getting a lot of attention lately. We're developing next-generation software solutions for enterprise clients. The man nodded as if this information was fascinating. TechFlow Solutions. How impressive. Tell me, what qualifications do you have for developing these solutions? What's your background? Jessica lifted her chin, sensing firmer ground. I have an MBA from UC Berkeley. Marcus has his bachelor's from Stanford. We've all got excellent educational credentials. Educational credentials, the man mused. Wonderful. And real-world experience? Have you ever been in a situation where people's lives depended on your decisions? Where failure wasn't just about losing money or missing a deadline, but about people not coming home to their families? The group fell silent again, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. Other customers had given up any pretense of not listening and were openly watching the exchange. Because, the man continued, the woman you were so eager to judge and belittle has more real-world experience than most people acquire in a lifetime. She's made decisions under pressure that would break most people. She's served her country with distinction in ways you can't imagine and will probably never understand. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped down the counter. How did this stranger know so much about her service? She'd been careful to keep that part of her life private, especially after some of the reactions she'd gotten when people learned about her military background. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Jessica said, her voice smaller now. We didn't mean anything by it. We were just making conversation. The man's expression hardened. No misunderstanding at all. You were engaging in casual cruelty because you thought you could get away with it. You saw someone you perceived as beneath you and decided to entertain yourselves at her expense. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Let me tell you something about service, about real contribution to society. That woman has probably forgotten more about leadership, sacrifice, and genuine achievement than you've ever learned. While you were safe in your classrooms and internships, she was serving something bigger than herself. Marcus tried to interrupt, but the man held up a hand, and somehow that simple gesture commanded absolute silence. You want to know about qualifications? About credentials that matter? How about classified operations completed successfully? How about lives saved through quick thinking and dedication? How about the kind of character that keeps you going when everything around you is falling apart? Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This stranger was defending her with a passion that she'd almost forgotten existed in the world. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than just another service worker. Now, the man said, his voice returning to its earlier calm tone, I believe you owe someone an apology. A sincere one, not the half-hearted excuse you're probably preparing to mumble. Jessica looked around the table at her companions, clearly hoping one of them would step up to handle the situation. When no help came, she turned back to the man with a weak smile. Look, maybe we were a little harsh, but we didn't know you didn't know, the man cut her off, because you didn't care to know. You made assumptions based on superficial observations and decided that gave you the right to be cruel. Not knowing isn't an excuse, it's the problem. The entire coffee shop had gone silent except for the gentle hum of the espresso machine. Sarah could feel every eye in the place on their table, and she found herself holding her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Stand up, the man said quietly. Jessica blinked. Excuse me? Stand up. All of you. And walk over to that counter and apologize properly to the woman you spent the morning trying to humiliate. The group exchanged panicked glances. This was clearly not how they'd expected their morning to go. Marcus started to stand, then sat back down. Now wait just a minute. You can't tell us what to do. Who do you think you are? The man's smile returned, and this time it was genuinely amused. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal something that made Marcus's face go white. Sarah couldn't see what was in the wallet from her position behind the counter, but the effect on Jessica's group was immediate and dramatic. Marcus's mouth fell open. Jessica's eyes went wide. The other two members of their group simply stared in shock. "Let me introduce myself properly," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the silent shop. "Admiral Jonathan Hayes, United States Navy. Retired, but the rank tends to stick." Sarah's clipboard clattered to the floor. Admiral Hayes. She knew that name. Every Navy intelligence specialist knew that name. He was a legend in certain circles, a man whose career was the stuff of whispered stories and classified briefings. And he was standing in her coffee shop, defending her honor. "Now," Admiral Hayes continued, his tone still conversational but carrying an undercurrent of absolute authority, "I'm going to ask you one more time to stand up and apologize properly. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do. Because that young woman has earned your respect 100 times over, and because decent human beings don't treat each other the way you've been treating her." Jessica fumbled with her purse strap, her hands shaking. We didn't know she was military." "And that matters why?" the Admiral asked. "Should civility be reserved only for those who've served in uniform? Should basic human decency be contingent on someone's background meeting your approval?" Marcus stood up slowly, looking like a man walking to his execution. "You're right. We were out of line. Completely out of line." One by one, the rest of the group stood as well, their earlier arrogance replaced by what looked like genuine shame. They walked toward the counter like children who'd been caught stealing candy, their expensive clothes and confident attitudes offering them no protection against the reality of their behavior. Sarah watched them approach, her mind still reeling from the revelation of Admiral Hayes' identity. She'd read about his service record during her own training, the classified missions, the strategic innovations, the lives saved through his leadership. He was the kind of officer that junior personnel aspired to be, the kind of leader that others followed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And, somehow, he'd ended up in her coffee shop on the very day she needed him most. Jessica reached the counter first, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Sarah, we owe you an apology. A real apology. The things we said were inexcusable." Sarah looked past Jessica to where Admiral Hayes stood watching, his expression unreadable. He gave her the slightest nod, and somehow that gesture conveyed both support and encouragement. "We made assumptions," Marcus added, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were wrong, and we're sorry. Truly sorry." Sarah studied their faces, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus simple fear of the Admiral's authority. What she saw was complicated, embarrassment, certainly, and fear, but also what appeared to be real shame. These weren't bad people, she realized. They were thoughtless people who'd been caught in their thoughtlessness by someone they couldn't dismiss or intimidate. "Thank you," she said finally. "I appreciate the apology." Jessica nodded rapidly. "We'll be going now." "And, Sarah? We really are sorry. We'll do better." The group gathered their things quickly and left the shop without another word, the bell above the door chiming their retreat. The other customers watched them go, then turned their attention back to Admiral Hayes, who remained standing by their abandoned table. Sarah found herself alone behind the counter with the most senior Navy officer she'd ever encountered, uncertain of what to say or do next. The morning had taken a turn she never could have predicted, and she was still trying to process everything that had happened. Admiral Hayes walked back to the counter, his bearing as straight and confident as before, but his expression had softened considerably. When he reached the register, he looked directly at her with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "How are you holding up, sailor?" Sarah stared at Admiral Hayes, her mind racing to process not just his presence, but his recognition of her service. The coffee shop had returned to its normal hum of conversation, but she felt like she was standing in a bubble of surreal calm. "I'm fine, sir," she managed, falling back on military protocol even though she was no longer bound by it. "Thank you for what you did." Admiral Hayes studied her with the same intensity she'd noticed earlier, but now it felt different. It wasn't the assessment of a stranger, but the evaluation of one service member by another. "You don't have to call me sir anymore, Sarah. We're both civilians now." "But old habits die hard, don't they?" The use of her name startled her. She was certain she'd never introduced herself to him. "How did you know your name?" He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You've been wearing a name tag for the past hour." "But, more than that, I know who you are, Petty Officer Martinez. Or rather, who you were." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, I don't understand." Admiral Hayes glanced around the coffee shop, noting that while conversation had resumed, several customers were still stealing glances in their direction. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately? I think we have some things to discuss." Sarah looked toward the back office, then at Tom, who was busy with a customer at the other end of the counter. "Tom," she called out, "I'm taking my break." Tom waved without looking up, clearly trusting her to manage her own schedule. Sarah let Admiral Hayes through the employee door into the small break room behind the main shop area. It was cramped and cluttered with supplies, but it offered the privacy they needed. "Please, sit," Sarah said, gesturing to one of the two folding chairs around a card table that served as the employee dining area. She remained standing, unsure of the protocol for this unprecedented situation. Admiral Hayes sat down and gestured for her to do the same. "Relax, Sarah. This isn't a formal meeting." She took the other chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Sir, how do you know my service record?" "Because 3 years ago, I signed a commendation letter for Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez of Naval Intelligence. The same Sarah Martinez who successfully extracted vital information from a high-value target in Kandahar, information that prevented a coordinated attack on 3 different forward operating bases." Sarah's world tilted. She remembered that mission, remembered the tension and the stakes, but she'd never known how far up the chain her debrief had gone. "I had no idea that reached your desk, sir." "The best intelligence work usually goes unnoticed by design," Admiral Hayes said. "But when something prevents American casualties on that scale, it gets attention at the highest levels. Your work saved lives, Sarah. A lot of lives." She felt heat behind her eyes again, but this time for different reasons entirely. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of leaving the military, of walking away from the only career she'd ever wanted. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way crowds made her skin crawl, it had all combined to make continuing her service impossible. But she'd never stopped wondering if she'd made a mistake, if she'd given up too easily. "I left," she said quietly. "I couldn't handle it anymore. The stress, the constant deployment cycles, the things I'd seen. I felt like I was failing everyone." Admiral Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Do you know why I'm in San Diego, Sarah?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I'm here for the opening of a new Veteran Services Center. A facility designed specifically for service members transitioning to civilian life, particularly those dealing with the invisible wounds of their service. PTSD, adjustment disorders, survivor guilt, all the things that the military is finally starting to understand and address properly." Sarah looked up at him, confused by the connection. "The center was funded partly by a foundation I run," Admiral Hayes continued. "We focus on supporting veterans who served in high-stress, high-stakes positions, people like intelligence specialists, special operations, combat medics. People whose service took a particular toll because of the nature of what they did." "I still don't understand why you're telling me this." Admiral Hayes smiled. "Because you didn't fail anyone, Sarah. You served with distinction until the cost became too high, and then, you made the intelligent decision to preserve your mental health and your future. That's not failure, that's strategic thinking. The words hit her like a physical blow. Strategic thinking. Not cowardice, not weakness, not giving up. Strategic thinking. The things that happen to you out there, the stress responses, the difficulty adjusting, those are normal reactions to abnormal situations. They're not character flaws or signs of weakness. They're the natural result of a mind and body that were pushed to their limits in service of something bigger than yourself. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, surprised to find them wet. It doesn't feel normal. It feels like I lost everything I was. What you were in the military is still part of who you are now, Admiral Hayes said firmly. The skills, the discipline, the ability to think under pressure, those don't disappear when you change uniforms. They just find new applications. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Can I ask what you're doing besides working here? I don't mean that as a judgment, I mean it as someone who's curious about your plans. I'm taking night classes, Sarah said, surprised by how defensive she sounded. Business administration. I'm thinking about maybe starting my own company someday. Something involving logistics or security consulting. Admiral Hayes nodded approvingly. Military logistics experience translated to civilian applications. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'm talking about. You're not just surviving your transition, you're building something new. It doesn't feel like building. Most days, it feels like barely keeping my head above water. That's because you're doing it alone, Admiral Hayes said. One of the biggest mistakes we made for decades was sending people back into civilian life without proper support systems. We trained you to work as part of a team, to rely on your unit, to function within a structure of mutual support. Then, we discharged you and expected you to figure out civilian life with no backup and no guidance. Sarah thought about her apartment, about the long evenings studying alone, about the way she'd isolated herself from her civilian co-workers because they couldn't understand her background. She'd been living like she was still undercover, still protecting classified information, still keeping her true self hidden from everyone around her. The center I'm opening, Admiral Hayes continued, it's designed to address exactly that problem. It provides not just counseling and medical support, but practical assistance with education, career transition, financial planning, even help with starting businesses. It's about building new communities for people who've left their military communities behind. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I'd like you to consider coming to our opening ceremony next week. Not as someone who needs help, but as someone whose story demonstrates exactly why this kind of support is essential. Sarah took the card, reading the elegant script, Admiral Jonathan Hayes, Director, Phoenix Veterans Foundation. Below that was an address and phone number. I don't know, she said. I'm not really comfortable talking about my service. You wouldn't have to talk about classified details, Admiral Hayes assured her. But your experience, leaving a successful military career to pursue education and entrepreneurship, dealing with the challenges of transition while building toward future goals, that's exactly the kind of story other veterans need to hear. Sarah studied the card, thinking about the possibility. The idea of standing in front of a room full of people and discussing her struggles terrified her. But it also stirred something else, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for 3 years. What happened out there today, Admiral Hayes said, with those people mocking you and making assumptions about your worth, that's going to keep happening as long as veterans remain invisible in civilian life. As long as people don't understand what military service entails, what it costs, and what it produces in terms of capable, disciplined individuals. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know what I saw when I walked in here this morning? I saw someone maintaining perfect composure under pressure, someone who refused to be provoked despite deliberate attempts to humiliate her. I saw someone with the discipline to do her job well regardless of how she was being treated. Those are military skills, Sarah. They're valuable skills that translate directly to civilian success. Then, why doesn't it feel like success? Sarah asked. Why does it feel like I'm wasting everything I learned, everything I was? Because you're measuring yourself against the wrong standards, Admiral Hayes said. You're comparing your current position to your military rank instead of comparing your current trajectory to where you started 3 years ago. You're not supposed to have rebuilt your entire life in 3 years. You're supposed to be in the process of building it, which is exactly what you're doing. Sarah considered this perspective. 3 years ago, she'd left the military with severe anxiety, nightmares that kept her awake for days at a time, and no plan for civilian life. Now she had stable employment, was making progress toward a degree, and had concrete plans for her future. When viewed that way, her progress seemed more significant. The young people who were giving you trouble, Admiral Hayes continued, they've never faced real adversity. They've never had to rebuild themselves from scratch, never had to translate skills from one context to a completely different one. Their arrogance comes from the fact that they've never been truly tested. They seemed pretty confident in their superiority. Admiral Hayes chuckled. Confidence and competence are two very different things. I've seen plenty of people with impressive credentials fall apart the first time they faced a genuine crisis. And I've seen people like you, people who've been tested under fire, adapt and succeed in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd carried for so long that she'd stopped noticing it was there. For the first time in 3 years, someone was looking at her civilian life and seeing it not as a step down from her military service, but as a natural continuation of it. There's something else I want to discuss, Admiral Hayes said. The foundation I run, we're always looking for people with your background to help with veteran services. People who understand both the military experience and the challenges of transition. Sarah looked up sharply. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to consider whether you might want to be involved in something bigger than your current situation. Part-time at first, perhaps, while you finish your degree. But, eventually, if you're interested, we could use someone with your skills and experience in a more substantial role. The possibility hung in the air between them like a bridge Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Part of her had accepted that her military career was over, that she would never again be part of something with that sense of mission and purpose. The idea that she could serve in a different way, help other veterans navigate the challenges she'd faced alone, was both exciting and terrifying. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Admiral Hayes said, standing up from his chair. Take all the time you need. The opportunity isn't going anywhere. They returned to the main area of the coffee shop, where the morning rush had given way to a more relaxed lunch crowd. Sarah walked Admiral Hayes to the door, still processing everything that had happened in the span of a single morning. Admiral, she said as he reached for the door handle, thank you. For defending me, for the opportunity, for helping me see things differently. He turned back to her with a smile. Thank you for your service, Sarah. Both your military service and what you're doing now. Building a new life takes as much courage as anything you did overseas. As Admiral Hayes left the coffee shop, Sarah stood behind the counter with his business card in her hand and a completely different understanding of her own story. The morning had started with humiliation and doubt. It was ending with possibility and hope. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just survival, but true success, success measured not by other people's standards, but by her own sense of purpose and contribution. She thought about the other veterans who might be struggling with similar feelings of displacement and isolation, and, for the first time, she wondered if her own difficult journey might have prepared her to help them find their way. 1 week later, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for the Phoenix Veterans Foundation opening ceremony. The business card Admiral Hayes had given her sat on her dresser, slightly worn from the number of times she'd picked it up over the past week, reading and rereading the information. She'd called the number 3 days after their conversation, her hands shaking as she dialed. The receptionist had been warm and professional, immediately recognizing Admiral Hayes's name and confirming that yes, they were expecting to hear from her. The opening ceremony would include brief remarks from several veterans about their transition experiences. Sarah had agreed to speak, though she still wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say. The drive to the Veterans Center took her through parts of San Diego she'd never seen before, away from the tourist areas and business districts where she spent most of her time. The building itself was modern and welcoming, with large windows and an open design that felt nothing like the institutional facility she'd expected. A banner across the entrance read Phoenix Veterans Foundation, rising from service to success. Sarah parked and sat in her car for a few minutes, watching other people arrive. Some were clearly military or former military, she could spot them by their bearing and the way they moved. Others appeared to be civilians, probably donors or community leaders. A news van was setting up in the parking lot, and Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of speaking in front of cameras. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. The main reception area had been converted into an event space with a small stage and rows of chairs. Display boards around the room showcased the various services the center would offer: career counseling, educational support, mental health services, financial planning, and small business development assistance. Sarah Martinez? She turned to find a woman in her 40s approaching with a warm smile. The woman was dressed professionally but casually, and moved with the confident bearing that Sarah had learned to associate with former military officers. "I'm Colonel Janet Rodriguez, retired Marines, now the center's program director. Admiral Hayes told me to watch for you. I'm so glad you decided to come." Sarah shook the offered hand, immediately noticing the firm grip and direct eye contact that marked another veteran. "Thank you for including me. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about speaking." "That's completely normal," Colonel Rodriguez assured her. "Most people find it intimidating at first. But your story is exactly what other veterans need to hear, someone who struggled with transition but found her path forward." They were interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Admiral Hayes had arrived, and his presence drew immediate attention from the growing crowd. He was in full dress uniform today, his ribbons and decorations creating a colorful display across his chest. Sarah recognized some of them: the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, campaign ribbons from conflicts she'd only read about in military history. Admiral Hayes spotted her across the room and made his way over, stopping to greet other attendees along the way. When he reached her, his smile was genuinely pleased. "Sarah, I'm delighted you came. How are you feeling about speaking today?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But ready." "That's the perfect combination," he said with a laugh. "Terror keeps you focused, readiness helps you succeed." The ceremony began with Colonel Rodriguez introducing the center's mission and services. She spoke about the challenges facing veterans in transition, the gaps in existing support systems, and the Foundation's commitment to addressing those needs comprehensively. Sarah found herself impressed by the scope of what they were trying to accomplish. It was far more extensive than she'd realized. Admiral Hayes spoke next, his remarks focusing on the broader responsibility that society had to support its veterans. He talked about the investment the military made in training and developing its people, and how that investment was wasted when veterans couldn't successfully transition to civilian careers that utilized their skills. "We train our service members to be leaders, problem solvers, and strategic thinkers," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Then, we send them into a civilian world that often doesn't recognize those skills or provide pathways to apply them. This center represents our commitment to changing that dynamic." Sarah was scheduled to speak third, after a former Army Ranger who had started a successful construction company and a Navy corpsman who had become a nurse practitioner. Both of their stories were inspiring, but they seemed to follow a more linear path than her own experience. The Ranger had immediately enrolled in business school after his discharge. The corpsman had used military education benefits to fast-track through nursing school. Both had found clear translations from their military roles to civilian careers. Sarah's story felt messier, more complicated. She hadn't known what she wanted to do when she left the military. She'd struggled with mental health issues that had delayed her educational plans. Her current job wasn't directly related to her military experience, and her future plans were still evolving. As she listened to the other speakers, she began to worry that her experience was too different, too uncertain, to be helpful to other veterans. When Colonel Rodriguez called her name, Sarah walked to the podium on unsteady legs. The audience was larger than she'd expected, at least 100 people, including what appeared to be several reporters. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd, searching for Admiral Hayes. When she found him in the third row, he gave her an encouraging nod. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. I left the Navy after 8 years of service. I was a staff sergeant in naval intelligence, and I was good at my job. But I was also struggling with anxiety and PTSD from my deployments, and I made the decision to prioritize my mental health and leave military service. She paused, looking around the room. Several audience members were nodding, clearly relating to her experience. I want to be honest about what the last 3 years have been like, because I think sometimes we only hear the success stories, the people who made smooth transitions and found immediate success in civilian careers. My story is different. My transition has been hard, messy, and sometimes discouraging. Sarah talked about her struggles to find employment that felt meaningful, about the isolation she'd experienced living away from military communities, about the way civilian coworkers and customers sometimes treated her when they learned about her background. She discussed the financial pressure of working a service job while trying to pay for college, and the way she'd sometimes questioned whether leaving the military had been a mistake. For a long time, she said, I measured my civilian life against my military career and found it lacking. I felt like I was wasting the skills and training the Navy had given me. I felt like I was starting over from zero instead of building on what I'd already accomplished. She could see people in the audience leaning forward, clearly engaged with her story. What I've learned, partly through my own experience and partly through conversations with people like Admiral Hayes, is that transition isn't about finding a civilian job that perfectly matches your military role. It's about understanding how the skills and qualities you developed in service can be applied in new contexts. Sarah talked about the discipline required to work full-time while attending college classes, about the leadership skills she used even in her coffee shop job, about the strategic thinking involved in planning her future career while managing her current responsibilities. I'm not where I want to be yet, she continued. I'm still in school, still working in food service, still figuring out exactly what my long-term career will look like. But I've stopped seeing that as failure. Instead, I see it as the process of building something new while honoring what I've already accomplished. The audience was completely silent, hanging on her words. The incident that led to my being here today involved some customers at my workplace making assumptions about my intelligence and worth based on my job. For a moment, their comments made me feel ashamed of where I am in my life. But then, Admiral Hayes reminded me of something important. Where I am now is not where I'm going to end up. It's just one stage in a longer journey. Sarah looked directly at Admiral Hayes as she continued. He also reminded me that the skills I developed in military service, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to think strategically, to persist through difficulties, those skills are still with me. They're just being applied in different ways. She concluded her remarks by talking about the importance of veterans supporting each other through the transition process. We learned in the military that no one succeeds alone. That's just as true in civilian life. Centers like this one provide the community and support that can make the difference between a veteran who struggles in isolation and one who thrives with help. When Sarah finished speaking, the applause was immediate and sustained. As she walked back to her seat, several audience members reached out to shake her hand or offer quiet words of encouragement. One woman, tears in her eyes, pressed a business card into Sarah's hand and whispered, "Thank you for being honest about the struggles." I needed to hear that. After the formal ceremony ended, the reception gave Sarah a chance to meet other veterans and learn more about the center's programs. She was surprised by how many people approached her to discuss their own transition experiences. Some were success stories, but many were works in progress like herself, people still figuring out their path forward. Colonel Rodriguez introduced her to Maria Santos, a former Air Force mechanic who was using the center's small business development program to start an auto repair shop. I spent 2 years thinking I had to find a job working for someone else, Maria explained. It never occurred to me that I could use my military experience to start my own business until I got connected with the resources here. Sarah met David Chen, a former Navy medic who was pursuing his bachelor's degree with help from the center's educational support program. I was intimidated by going back to school, he admitted. I thought I was too old, that I'd been out of the classroom too long. But they helped me understand that military experience actually prepared me for academic success in ways I hadn't considered. As the reception wound down, Admiral Hayes approached Sarah with what appeared to be genuine pride. "That was outstanding," he said. "You found exactly the right balance between honesty about the challenges and optimism about the possibilities." "Thank you," Sarah replied. It felt important to be truthful about the difficulties. It was important, Admiral Hayes agreed. Too many veteran success stories skip over the messy middle parts. Your willingness to share those parts makes your eventual success more meaningful and more helpful to others. He paused, studying her expression. "I meant what I said about opportunities with the foundation. After hearing you speak today, I'm even more convinced that you have something valuable to offer other veterans." Colonel Rodriguez joined their conversation. "We're launching a peer mentorship program in the spring," she explained. "Veterans who are further along in their transition working with those who are just starting the process. Based on your remarks today, I think you'd be perfect for it." Sarah considered the offer. 6 months ago, she would have assumed she wasn't qualified to mentor anyone, that she didn't have enough success to share. But her perspective had shifted. She realized that her ongoing struggle with transition, combined with the insights she'd gained along the way, might actually make her more helpful to other veterans than someone whose path had been smoother. "I'd like to learn more about that," she said. "Excellent," Colonel Rodriguez replied. "Why don't you plan to come in next week for a more detailed conversation about the program?" As Sarah prepared to leave the center, she reflected on how dramatically her week had changed. 7 days ago, she'd been standing behind a coffee counter being mocked by strangers who saw her as a failure. Tonight, she was part of a community of veterans who understood her journey and valued her experience. The difference wasn't in her circumstances, she was still working at the coffee shop, still taking night classes, still building toward an uncertain future. The difference was in how she understood her own story. Admiral Hayes walked her to her car, their conversation continuing in the parking lot. "I have one more thing to share with you," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This arrived at my office yesterday." Sarah opened the envelope to find a letter on TechFlow Solutions' letterhead. It was addressed to Admiral Hayes, and, as she read it, her eyes widened with surprise. The letter was from Jessica, the woman who had led the group mocking her at the coffee shop. It was a formal apology, but, more than that, it was a request for Admiral Hayes to recommend veterans for potential employment at TechFlow Solutions. Jessica had apparently gone back to her company and told them about the encounter, about Admiral Hayes' explanation of Sarah's background and qualifications. The company was interested in exploring how they could better recruit and support veteran employees. "She included a personal note for you," Admiral Hayes said, pointing to a handwritten addition at the bottom of the letter. "Sarah, I can't undo what I said, but I can try to make sure it never happens again to another veteran. If you're ever interested in the tech industry, I'd welcome the chance to discuss opportunities with our company. Jessica Morrison." Sarah stared at the letter, amazed by the unexpected turn of events. "I never imagined." "People can surprise you," Admiral Hayes said. "Sometimes an uncomfortable confrontation with their own behavior can lead to genuine change." "Not always, but sometimes." As Sarah drove home that evening, she thought about the chain of events that had started with humiliation in a coffee shop and ended with new possibilities for her future. She thought about the other veterans she'd met at the center, about the mentorship program Colonel Rodriguez had described, about Jessica's unexpected job offer. Most importantly, she thought about the shift in her own perspective. She was still the same person doing the same job she'd been doing a week ago. But she no longer saw herself as someone who had failed to live up to her potential. Instead, she saw herself as someone in the process of creating new potential, building on the foundation of her military service while adapting to the opportunities and challenges of civilian life. When she arrived at her apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She had a paper due for her business administration class, but first, she wanted to do something else. She opened a new document and began typing "Personal Statement for Phoenix Veterans Foundation Mentorship Program Application." As she wrote about her experience, her challenges, and her goals, Sarah realized that she was no longer writing as someone who was ashamed of her journey. She was writing as someone who understood that her struggles and successes alike had prepared her to help others navigate their own transitions from military to civilian life. The woman who had been mocked behind a coffee counter a week ago was the same woman who had spoken confidently to a room full of veterans and community leaders today. The difference was not in her circumstances, but in her understanding of her own worth and potential. And that understanding, she realized, was something she could share with other veterans who might be struggling with their own sense of purpose and direction. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah went to bed that night feeling genuinely excited about her future, not because her situation had dramatically changed, but because she finally understood that she was exactly where she needed to be in order to become who she was meant to be.